I am super excited. As I said, I know I dumped a lot of stuff on you today, but I'm super excited to start sorting out and organizing thoughts and getting into verses and concepts, even if we do it more of a bird's eye view through Exodus, through Leviticus, to kind of rightly put this in order. And I am not mistaken on this. This is one area where I'm so glad, even though it's a gargantuan task, to sort out the language frame, because I have read enough verses that I kind of sat back and said, well, how, you meditate on something. How does one get there? How do you achieve this? What is intended? And we know the one thing that for sure we can say absolutely God did not intend for us to try to be something. I know the Greek, a lot of times Paul will say, be imitators of me. But we're not talking about that. God is not looking for imitations like cheap knockoffs. He's looking for the authentic and the real. And the authentic and the real come when we respond to his word in the sincerity that we're desiring to know, what exactly does this mean for me? And that's where I kind of found myself. There are 5 verses of scripture that refer to holiness that really actually had me a little bit plagued based on our language frame. That just, to me, was, I think I better tackle this. And so I started picking apart the words, and I realized this is even more challenging than I thought, because we're dealing with these Latin words from sanctus. We get our English words like sanctimonious, for example. You've got that stream. Then if you look carefully, you've got the words for sacred, sacrifice. It's actually another word grouping. Holiness, holy, hallow, consecrate, desecrate, and some of these aren't obviously antonyms, synonyms, but the word groupings themselves that they're not derived from the same word. Yet we're reading them, and it's almost like we've taken it's there, so it must be okay that it's being read like that. But the fact of the matter is, like I pointed out to you, we're reading sodomite, we're reading unclean, we're reading whore and harlot. And I think there is a reference I'm not quite sure if it is in the, might be in Maccabees actually. There's a reference definitively to the temple prostitutes. But how could we be using the same word? How could the same word, it's the same Hebrew word, and we know when we change the vowels underneath the Hebrew letters, it will change the word. But more importantly, and this is the thing, it's like, wow, I'm so glad I went through the labor of picking apart the Hebrew language and teaching it, because as you get into the verbal forms of the same Kadesh words, you find greater clarity comes as you go through call it conjugation of the Hebrew. In the call, in the present or the future, which is just a simple, like a simple tense, it can be referring to that which is being described. It can be the act of making something in a simple way, or a future time of making something eventually, because God says, go and do this, which will become a simple act. It could be in the present or the future. But when you get into the niffle of the Hebrew, you find out that this word the niffle is essentially of God, where you can kind of glean that niffle would not be used of anyone else but God. He is the subject. He will be the subject of the activity, and he will also be the activator of the activity. So the niffle belongs to him. And as you go down the PL and the pual, the passive, the intensive and the passive, the word changes. Here's the disconnect, at least for the Hebrew. In the verbal realm, because of the nature of the language, it's not quite like English when we conjugate something like I am running, I had, would you say, I had ran or had run? However you conjugate it, but the essence of your verb will stay the same it will be the time, the actor and the time that will change. But your word, even though your word may change in taking in endings, or we may modify, the basic essence of the word stays the same, but not so in the Hebrew. So in the Hebrew, you're going to have, for example, the PL is the intensifier. So something that would be labeled as the act of making something holy and intensely. You have a causative, to make, to cause to make something, which again, the declaration can only come from God. It may come from God to Moses, or it may come from God to Joshua, but it comes from God causatively to cause something to become or to be declared to be. In the reflexive forms, God shows himself to be holy. So again, as we travel through the verbs will help us. And I probably will, for this, will probably do a handout to be able to kind of give the examples, especially for people who didn't study Hebrew and who are not necessarily interested in taking up Hebrew as a study. I'll probably do a handout to make it clear. But the essence of the verbs, they will change. Your root will stay the same. Your trilateral, your biconsonant, actually it's trilateral root will stay the same, but the meanings and perhaps the vowels, as you know, if you've studied the Hebrew, and the vowels that go under the verbs will change. So we'll look at that, and then we'll come back to look at the English and ask important questions, which I don't tend to like to do because it brings confusion. But why in some places, for example, why we have the word being translated, for example, sanctify or sanctifying, the verbal sense of the word, not all the time, but the vast majority of the time will be translated verbal form, sanctify, sanctifying. And when it is in the nominal or the noun form or adjective, it will be holy or holiness. Not all the time, but that seems to be the bulk of the words, and then there are these exceptions. So in isolating these things, you kind of can start piecing together what the word means, actually, how it's used, the context, which is super important. I always say don't take it out of the context, study it in its context, which will allow us then to kind of move through, see, as I said, the Septuagint, how it was used there. And there we stumble upon something very important, because I will toss in a little bit of, I would like to show you the development of the use of the word priest and why you're going to find this word attached in many ways to holiness or sanctified, but the use of our word actually changed. And if you look into the New Testament, you see words like presbyter, presbyteros, overseer, all the words that are being described as someone who is bishop or overseer of the church. And you'll notice that except for, I believe, maybe 1 Peter and Hebrews, you'll have the use of the words priest, but they did not favor using that word for a reason. Between the 14th and by the time the King James translation was done, our word for priest had already taken on kind of a meaning of its own, which may not have been part of the original meaning, which would maybe let us go back to some of the words we're looking at. So there are a lot of reasons to investigate this. The word, for example, I've mentioned this before, sacerdotal, which comes from the Latin, which is the service of the priests, which again fell out of use. And there's a reason for this, because there was confusion between several words that I guess when ultimately probably the King James puts the timestamp on it, by about the time of the King James, there were certain words that had already fell into disuse and were not being used anymore. So it's important for us that way. Then we'll also look at our language frame and the development of the words that I've shown you from the Old English, Old Norse, Teutonic, all of those, how into our language frame we might actually connect the words from our English language frame into some of the words that are being represented, not all of them. Something I introduced last week, which is the spelling of the words in our older attempt to translate the word or to bring it H-E-I-L, the hail, helio, which, as I said, are attached to the sun, which brings in a whole different essence or a whole different meaning. So we have a lot of territory to cover. And then ultimately, when you get into the New Testament, this is where all of that information will let us actually rightly understand. And as I said, my pet peeve, and it has been my pet peeve for a long time, if you and I think that a certain word, let's take the word holiness, if you and I have been conditioned through our language frame, through society, through whatever, that holy or holiness carries the connotation of perfection or purity, we'll say something that is untainted and therefore must fall into the category of perfect or perfection, how can we ever be that? And then I come back to the verse that I quoted out of Hebrews. If I can't be that, then that means I can never see God. So it cannot have an exterior add-on. It must be something that God is doing in me as he declares something to be. And in the New Testament, the whole essence of that changes. We're no longer dealing with ceremonial and ritual. It is a simple declaration that's made, and in at least, I think, 4 different passages, when Christ is speaking, it is minimally understood, if not implied. That's what's being said without the words actually occurring that way. So a lot of stuff to put in order and then straighten out and see if we can get clarity on it. And it is important to me that some of these difficult words not be avoided, even though I know lots of people avoid them because it's like, oh, why do you want to go do that? Because I want to know, because I want you to know, because I want us to be clear on where we're going. And I'm not engaging in telling people, you got to do this and you got to do that. It's not by works, it's by faith. So there must be something more to this word than what this group over here, which is the holiness group, has described, which I don't want any part of. It's not what God intended. The thing that God declared, count me in on that, because it makes everything else that I have understood from the Bible, it's in line with everything else. The understanding that, say, those people over there have of this word is not in line and would put me in the mindset, if I was listening to those people, that somehow I do not possess what they claim to possess. And because they claim to possess it, I'm under the strong impression they don't. I may say that's rhetoric, but that's just the way it is. Somebody walks around and they're going to tell you about how, usually that's the smokescreen for something that is not. So I'm interested in knowing about this word, how it will apply to me and to you in the New Testament, most importantly, so that I'm not going around with bad ideas and thinking maybe it's good for those people, but it's certainly not for me. Oh no, the word is declared to you and to me, and anyone who will listen and not try and make it into some works and attempt to be or to achieve, but rather what has been declared. So we'll keep going. I hope you will not go crazy as I bring forth the information, but you'll take it in and then we will put it all together and hopefully you will have a good understanding of what this all means. Until then, guess what we're doing? I'm thinking you need to be here next Sunday, so I'm taking your reservations and your commitments. I'd like you to get on the telephone and get busy right now.